welcome everybody. I'm going to pass it off to our Executive Director, Nathaniel Stinnett, and I will be happily answering all of your questions in the Q&A, folks, so enjoy.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you. And thank you, Ren, who I see is already busy answering questions for folks in the Q&A. As Shannon mentioned, my name is Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, and I am so excited for tonight. If there is one takeaway from tonight, let it be this. Thank you. Thank you. This session this evening is about you. We like to provide opportunities for you that are evidence-based, that we know can have an impact. And so as part of that, we do a lot of research and we do a lot of measuring of whether our behavioral interventions are making a difference and are increasing impact. And it's important to us to report back to you, to report back to our volunteers and our donors on what's working and what isn't working. And so that's what tonight's going to be about. It's going to be about all of the stuff that you accomplished alongside us. Another part of that is I am so happy that there are some brand new people to EVP here. We're already seeing in the chat from some people who this is their first webinar. Welcome. We're so excited to see you. But please bear in mind what the next 57 minutes are going to be is not an intro level course to EVP. It's going to be more like a graduate level seminar. So hopefully you'll still find it very interesting. I think you will. But what we are not going to spend a lot of time doing this evening is giving a broad overview of what EVP does, why we do it, and how we do it. We're going to really quickly skim over that so that we can spend much more time going into the data, going into the results, and then going into some of our experimental findings on what worked and what didn't work. And then, as Shannon mentioned, we can get to the Q&A. In that Q&A, we're going to try to focus as much as possible on the 2021 results and what's coming up in 2022. But if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A there, and Shannon and Ren will either answer them or they won't, because maybe they're holding them for the Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I am going to share my screen here, and here we go. I hope these slides are going back and forth. I always like to ask Shannon to make sure. Awesome. Thank you, Shannon. So once again, this is where you are, the 2021 results briefing for the Environmental Voter Project. If you want to follow along on Twitter or Instagram, you can see the stuff down there. We're not going to be posting anything on there while we're doing this, but please feel free to post yourselves. This is what we've got coming up tonight. We're going to start with a very quick intro, and I mean very quick intro to the Environmental Voter Project. Then we're going to do deeper dives on our 2021 election-specific results, by which I mean our results in one-off elections. Then we're going to get into our multi-year cumulative impact. So what is the impact we are having on the electorate over multiple years in the states where we work? Then we're going to move on to some, we can't go through all of them because we don't have the time, but some of our experimental findings. Because even though our main focus at the Environmental Voter Project is getting lots of environmentalists to vote, we like to bring a lot of precision to that work. And as part of that precision, we're always running experiments to try to optimize our messaging. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to move on to looking ahead to the midterms and what the next 7 months will be like. And then hopefully we will have a really fun, interesting, robust Q&A session. So let's get started. Very quickly, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that just focuses on this. We turn non-voting environmentalists into consistent voters. That's it. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. That also means we don't do a lot of the stuff that a lot of other environmental groups do. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. we don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment, as odd as that might sound. A good way to think of our work is we aren't in the mind-changing business or the opinion-changing business. Instead, we are in the behavior-changing business. What we are trying to do is find all the people out there who don't need their minds changed. We want to find all the people who not only care about the climate crisis already, they care about it so much that it's their #1 priority over all other issues. So these are people who don't need their minds changed. Instead, what they need is a behavioral intervention. Because when we find these super environmentalists, we then narrow in on the ones of them who aren't voting. And then we at the Environmental Voter Project just focus on them and focus on behavior change. And what we do is these 3 things. 1, we build predictive models. We work with data scientists and on voter files, build these really complicated but precise scores that we're able to assign to every single voter in a state voter file. And this is a very complicated, convoluted process. And there's far more information about this in previous webinar briefings and in other reports and studies on our website. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it. But very briefly, what this process, what building predictive models on voter files allows us to do is individually identify voters with a very high degree of precision who list climate or the environment as their #1 priority. And then what that allows us to do is what I just briefly alluded to. It allows us to take these people and not waste any time or energy or money on the really expensive, hard stuff of politics, which is changing people's minds. Because once you find someone who cares so deeply about climate or the environment that you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change, that's a big opportunity. That's someone who doesn't need all that expensive messaging. They just need to change their behavior, which I won't claim is easy. It's not. But it's easier. It's cheaper. I mean, we live in a moment in time where it's almost impossible now to change people's minds about climate change. But if we can find people who not only don't need their minds changed, but it's already their top priority, and they're just not voting, well, that allows us to go to the second thing that you see, mobilization. Because then what we're able to do is use any behavioral science-informed messaging that works to just get these non-voters to start voting. We don't need to mix it with any climate messaging. We don't need to mix it with any environmental messaging, unless talking about those things is really good at getting people to vote. But the beauty of this approach is it allows us to be completely agnostic with our messaging. Some of you who have been to previous webinars have probably heard me say this line before, but it's true. And I think it really highlights what we're doing here. Once we find these people, we could talk about anything if it works. We could talk about chocolate chip cookies if talking about chocolate chip cookies is what's going to get these environmentalists to vote. Because remember, they're already with us. This is their top priority. And so what we do is we work with thousands of volunteers to canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to these people with optimized behavioral science-informed messaging, a lot of which we're going to talk about tonight. And we're always running randomized control trials to figure out which message over which communications medium works best with which subgroups of these environmental voters to just do one thing, and that is turn them from non-voters into consistent voters. And then finally, the third step is habit reinforcement. We don't just parachute into the big, sexy federal elections that happen every 2 years. That is not a good way to change long-term behavior. That is not a good way to take an electorate where there are, unfortunately, a very small number of climate-first voters and turn that into a large number of climate-first voters. No, you need to work year-round, and that's what we do. As you'll see, we were active in 381 different elections in 2021. 381. Because every election presents a behavioral intervention opportunity. When you are in the business of trying to turn non-voters into voters, shame on you if you ever let an election go by. Because the truth is, the only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to get them to vote in an election. And so you've got to take a bite out of every apple you see. And so we take this every election approach to changing these voters' behavior very, very seriously. And so those are the three aspects of our work: identifying these non-voting environmentalists, mobilizing them with behavioral science-informed messaging, and then working year-round using every election, even the ones that don't have obvious environmental policy ramifications, to change their voting behavior over time. And the reason we do this is that the number of non-voting environmentalists that we found out there is truly enormous. As you'll see in some of the later slides towards the end when we talk about the midterms, there are millions of these already registered to vote super environmentalists who have never voted in a midterm election before. And because we built these predictive models, not to get creepy, we literally know who they are by name and street address. And so what we're able to do is work with you to deliver this behavioral science-informed messaging to them and turn them into better voters. All right, so we are doing this great work year-round in the following 17 states. Don't worry, you're going to see these 17 states a bunch of times tonight as I present our data from last year and our plans for the coming year. But that is your very, very quick intro to the Environmental Voter Project. If this is your first time learning about us, please feel free to go to environmentalvoter.org/about. You'll be able to learn a lot more about what we do, why we do it, and how we do it. But the focus of this presentation is going to go into our results from last year. So let me speed right into that. In 2021, we were active in 381 elections. And we literally, I mean, maybe not every corner of the United States because we're not in Hawaii, but we were active in Nome, Alaska. We were active in Tucson, Arizona. We were active in Caribou, Maine, and we were active in South Beach, Miami. We were active all over in all of these elections, using every single one of them as a chance to talk to these non-voters, because that's how you change habits over time. As you'll see, we had 308 million individual voters who we contacted. Many of them we contacted multiple times over multiple elections, over multiple different communication channels. Working with volunteers, we were responsible for 4.1 million individual communications. And then without volunteers doing direct mail and digital ads, we made an additional almost 50 million touches with these voters. This was really, really robust, not just in the big elections, like the Virginia gubernatorial, or the Georgia US Senate runoffs, or the New York City mayoral election, but also in the really small ones. In fact, sometimes the really small ones are the highest return on investment. They're the easiest, cheapest ways to turn these non-voters into voters. All right, so the first way that we measure our election-specific results, remember what I said at the beginning, and we're going to talk about our election-specific results and then our long-term cumulative results. But the way that we measure our election-specific results is by using something called randomized controlled trials. Now, RCTs, randomized control trials, are used when testing medicine, and they're used in a lot of science, but in social science and behavioral science, it looks a little bit like this chart that you're seeing in front of you. And if you start on the left there with that big circle of people, imagine that is the universe of unlikely to vote environmentalists that we've identified in the state. And remember, we've identified these people on voter files, so we know who they are. Well then, what we do at the Environmental Voter Project, it's a little different from what most campaigns, well, certainly different from what campaigns do, and also different from what a lot of other organizations do, is when we find our targets, what we do not do is then just go off to the races and start communicating with them. No, before we do a single thing, before we make a single intervention, we randomly split that group of low propensity environmental voters into two subgroups. The one at the top is usually called a treatment group, and the one at the bottom that you see there is called a control group. Now, usually they're not evenly split. Usually it's about an 80-20 split for statistical reasons we don't need to go into. But what that allows us to do is set aside that control group that you see at the bottom. These are low propensity environmental voters. They came from that same big group at the beginning. We set them aside and we don't talk to them at all. Not at all. And what that will allow us to do at the end, and I'll describe this in more detail in a second, is use them as a group that we can compare the voters we did talk to, which will be very important. All right, so we set that control group aside. Then the group at the top, that's our treatment group, our treatment universe. These are the people who get our behavioral science informed interventions. These are the people we are calling and knocking on their door and sending them postcards and direct mail and digital ads, all with these nerdy behavioral science informed messages that we always talk about and experiment with, and many of you volunteers have seen. Then the election happens. Everybody else gets to clink champagne and talk about how their candidates won. Well, not us. We get to like sit and crunch numbers and 5 months later have a webinar with all you lovely people. But what happens over those 5 months is something very important, and that is that public voter files get updated. Many of you, if not all of you, know that who you vote for is always secret. But what some people don't know is that whether you vote or not, whether you cast a ballot, that's public record. That's public information. And anywhere from 2 to 4 months after any election, voter files get updated, and you can see who voted and who did not vote. Now, who they cast their ballot for, remember, that's secret, but we can see who voted and who didn't vote. And what these randomized control trials allow us to do then is look in our treatment group, the people who got our messaging, and see, okay, how many of those people voted? And then we can look at our control group, which, remember, is also low propensity environmental voters who were just randomly removed, and see how many of them voted. And then by comparing those two groups, we can get a really scientifically precise measurement of how much the Environmental Voter Project was solely responsible for increasing turnout over that control group. And when I say solely responsible, that's really important, because I really mean it. The idea of a randomized controlled experiment is that as long as the numbers are big enough to have what's called statistical significance, and as long as that initial separation process is truly random, well, it doesn't matter who else is talking to voters. If the Biden campaign spends $13 billion communicating with people, well, unless they hack into our system and only talk to people in our treatment group and nobody in our control group, that doesn't matter. We have controlled for that. Because in theory, they are talking to just as many people in our control group as in our treatment group. So that should come out in the wash. That's the beauty of these randomized control trials. They control for all these outside variables. This is how we at the Environmental Voter Project measure our impact in specific elections. Is there a downside to it? Yeah, it means that about 15 to 20% of our targets we don't talk to in any given election. But the upside is that, one, we can report back to you, our volunteers and donors, and let you know not only what worked and what didn't, but exactly what that impact was. We can also assure you going on into the future that your investment of time and money is based on evidence of stuff that works. And perhaps most importantly, because our goal is a medium to long-term one, which is to build the electoral power of the climate movement, we really need to know if what we're doing is working. We really need to know it, because we're not just going all in on one election. All right, so let's get to the results. In those 381 elections last year, in the 17 states that you see colored in green, we likely increased turnout in a whole lot of them. But what we know is that in certain numbers of them, the numbers were large enough and our impact was large enough that we could measure in those randomized control trials that we, the Environmental Voter Project, were solely responsible for a statistically significant increase in turnout. Now, again, does that mean that we didn't increase turnout in New Mexico last year? No, we probably did in dozens of elections. We just don't have incontrovertible proof that we were solely responsible while controlling for all other groups and campaigns out there for increasing turnout. And we want to be honest about what we know and what we don't know. What we know is that, as you'll see here, in local elections last year, we increased turnout by as much as 4.0 percentage points over our control group in Kansas. There were also local elections in Kansas where we boosted at 2% and 1.8% over our control group. Local election in San Antonio by 1.4 percentage points. The New York mayoral election, 1.8 percentage points. You see, the congressional election in Florida, the congressional special, we boosted at 3.9 percentage points. These are elections where we can tell with statistical significance at a 95% confidence level that we were solely responsible for that increase in turnout. As you'll see, we also had great results that we could say we were solely responsible for in primaries and general elections. A 0.7 percentage point boost in the Virginia primary, 0.8 percentage point boost in the Pennsylvania primary. These numbers might not sound like a lot, but they are everything in politics. And when you look at that 1.2 percentage points in Pennsylvania, remember how important a state Pennsylvania is going to be this year. Remember how important a state it was in 2020. And then in Georgia, see that 0.9%? What that was were those two US Senate runoff elections on January 5th, 2021 that decided control of the US Senate. That was a series of elections, those two US Senate runoffs, where a combined $1 billion was spent. 1 billion with a B. The Environmental Voter Project spent $550,000 in that election. And when voter files were updated, we could see that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout 0.9 percentage points over our control group among our targeted voters. Obviously, we weren't communicating with all Georgians. We were communicating with the roughly 290, 300,000 low propensity environmental voters, but we were solely responsible for that 0.9 percentage point boost in turnout, even with all that noise, all that static. These are some of the extraordinary results that we can prove to you you were solely responsible for with your volunteer time and your donations. And so not only thank you, but I hope you take real pride in this because you were a part of this. You helped make this happen. All right, let's move into some of our cumulative results. Forgive me if you've heard this story already, but it has become very quickly a favorite of mine. Right after those two US Senate runoff elections in Georgia, everybody left the state. You could hear the whooshing sound as the CNN trucks peeled out of the driveway and all the campaign hands got on the airplanes back to DC and all the groups and everybody, volunteers, left town. But not us. What the Environmental Voter Project did, believe it or not, was get right back to work mobilizing low propensity environmental voters. And yes, I kid you not, the Griffin Judicial Circuit District Attorney Special Election. And I bring this up not because this Griffin Judicial Circuit District Attorney Special Election was by any objective measure an important race, certainly not for environmental policymaking. But I bring it up as an example of what makes our work so unique. Because even though this small DA's race in a group of counties, because that's what a judicial circuit is, it's a bunch of counties that are too small to have their own DA, so they band together. The reason we were active in this is not because this little local election was important for environmental policymaking. It wasn't at all. But it was enormously important if what you're trying to do is change voting habits. It's enormously important if what you're trying to do is this October and this November, when you're talking to Georgians, not have been out of the state for 2 years. It remains so important to us to continue working with these people to build up their good voting habits. And so this teeny little election, which was far too small for us to get randomized control trial results from, 4,800 people we targeted, is an example of what makes us so unique. There are a lot of elections that I have to admit, by any objective measure, we work in them, and they are not that important for environmental policymaking. But they are crucially important if what you're trying to do is build up the political power of the environmental movement. And so, thank you for bearing with me. I love talking about this little Griffin Judicial Circuit District Attorney special election. All right, why is that important? Because when we look at our long-term cumulative results, this is what we do. Now, this is different from randomized control trials that I spoke about earlier. But what we do is whenever we communicate with one of these environmentalists who is unlikely to vote, we tag them in our database. And then we track them over time. And so far, over our almost 6 years, the Environmental Voter Project has communicated with almost 8.7 million unique different environmental voters, who by definition were unlikely to vote in at least an election, or we wouldn't have been talking to them. And what we try to do, what our long-term success metric is we try to find out how many of them become such consistent voters that they don't only vote in federal elections, they don't only vote in state elections, but they've started voting in local elections. And we passed a big milestone at the end of last year. Out of those almost 8.7 million low propensity environmental voters we've spoken with since the end of 2015, 1,030,912 of them are now voting so consistently that they're not even skipping their local elections. That is political power. That is what the IPCC report that came out last week said is what the climate movement needs, is more political power. And this is also something that all of you should be extraordinarily proud of. Now, I want to be clear. This long-term metric doesn't have the same level of precision as the randomized control trials that I told you about. What I cannot claim is that we at EVP are solely responsible for turning over 1 million non-voters into super voters. In fact, we are most surely not solely responsible for them. It's very hard for a whole bunch of reasons to run longitudinal, like multi-year randomized control trials. But boy, we're pretty darn responsible for it. There aren't any other organizations that are involved in hundreds of dinky little local elections each year just to make sure that these environmentalists continue to vote consistently, not only in the big elections, but also in the state and locals and the primaries and the specials. And so this is also something you should be extraordinarily proud of. This is what year-round work is supposed to build up to. This is why when you're worried about Arizona this fall, or Pennsylvania this fall, or Georgia this fall, you can say, oh, well, this is why we spent the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years creating 91,002 environmental super voters in Arizona. That's not something you can do by parachuting in September and October. It just isn't. So again, thank you, and I hope you feel tremendous pride over this. All right, the last thing I want to get into before we get into discussing our plans for 2022 is talk about some of our experiments and talk about not just some of the successful findings, but some of our failures. I mean, hopefully you're coming to realize, those of you who know us well, that we're pretty nerdy, and we try to be really honest about what the data is telling us. And boy, would we rather be smart than seem smart. And so I don't want to say we embrace our failures. Obviously, we would prefer not to fail, but we certainly don't ignore them either. Like, we want to learn from our failures. We're doing this to get better. We are doing this to build political power in the climate movement. So what we're going to do over the next few minutes is not just talk to you about some of our successful experimental findings. We're going to talk about some of our failures, because failures happen, and you need to know about that. And you also need to trust that we're using them to try to get better, rather than just like sweeping them under the rug. So let's talk about loss aversion, huh? All right, I told you this would be a good time. So one experiment, we got consistently good results with a new sort of messaging stream last year, where we were sending postcards, but also in some other messaging streams, using a behavioral psychology technique known as loss aversion. The concept behind loss aversion is that most people, not everybody, but most people, are more worried about losing $5 than they are excited about the prospect of getting $5. So the potential loss is worse than the potential gain is good. That's called loss aversion. And we tried to take advantage of that with a special subgroup of our voters this past year, because we knew there were a whole lot of environmentalists who voted in the super high turnout 2020 general election, yet they were unlikely to vote in their 2021 local or even statewide off-year elections. There are a lot of people like that. Maybe some of you are like that. You vote in at even years, but not odd years. And so what we wanted to do with these people, and you'll see an example of that in that little postcard there, is say, thank you for voting in 2020. Don't ruin your good voting record in 2021. So there are a few things going on there. One, we're kind of like subtly hinting towards like, we know that you voted. Like, we have access to this information, pal. We know whether you vote or not, which is a strong driver of getting people to vote. But more importantly, we made the act of voting in an off-year election not seem like a new thing, but rather made it seem as potentially losing something that they had already done. Our message was essentially, don't screw up your perfect voting streak. Don't mess it up. Rather than trying to convince people to do something that they had never done before, we were trying to convince them not to mess up their streak. And messaging like this is why we got some of the great results that we got in like the Boston mayoral election and some of those local elections in Kansas that you saw. That's where a lot of this messaging made such a really, really big impact. And it's something we're really excited to use again in 2022, because as you can imagine, there are a lot of people who vote in presidential elections but don't vote in midterms. And so we're really excited about using this same technique in those elections. And if any of you are funders or volunteers or otherwise affiliated with organizations that might have a use for this type of messaging, let us know. We're always happy to share more detail of our findings with people. Another experiment that we had was a texting experiment we did in Pennsylvania for the state primary, which I think was in May in 2021. And we tested 3 different messages. I'm not going to go into an enormous amount of detail of them, but we saw, especially among women, a really, really big difference in how those 3 messages landed. One was what I'll call a friends and family message. What this was what you'll see at the bottom there. Please make sure your friends and family vote in the state primary. Do you want information on blah, blah, blah? The behavioral science behind this is, rather than asking someone to do something, you are instead kind of like deputizing them, almost assuming, hey, voter, we know you're going to do the right thing, wink, wink, when in actuality, like, we wouldn't even be contacting them if they were good voters. But we don't say that. We contact them, we say, how about you be the norm enforcer? Can we give you information to make sure other people in your family vote? And that that ended up being much, much more successful than the other two messages we tested against that and against the control group. The other message was assumed good behavior. For that one, we weren't asking the voter to be a norm enforcer themselves. We were just assuming that they were going to vote. And so what we said was, there's an election coming up. Do you intend to vote by mail or in person or blah, blah, blah? We were like assuming you were going to do it to kind of like force them to tell us, oh, no, I'm not going to vote. Now that still had a statistically significant impact on turnout, boosted turnout 0.6 percentage points. We also had a group that got what we call sort of a fight for your rights message. There are examples of a bunch of experiments that show, particularly in subpopulations that often are the object of voter suppression efforts, if you message to them about voting as a way to fight back against establishment power, that will get them to vote. Now that message worked very well, but not as well as this friends and family message. And so again, this concept of, among women, mind you, this concept of deputizing the voter you're talking to as a norm enforcer. So we know we're only contacting Jane because she's an unlikely to vote environmentalist, but we're not even going to talk to Jane about her own voting behavior. We're going to call Jane and we're going to say, hey, Jane, can you make sure your friends and family vote? And when we do that, we realize that Jane's turnout goes through the roof with a really, really light, inexpensive touch. All right, another experiment that didn't go that well. Boy, are we struggling, just like the greater progressive movement is struggling, in figuring out how to message not just to Spanish speakers, but to all of the different subgroups within the broader Hispanic population. You don't need me to tell you how challenging that has been for the broader progressive movement lately. But as a preliminary matter to even being able to know which messages are better at moving which subpopulations of this group to vote, we need to be able to figure out, okay, well, who are the Spanish speakers and who aren't? And are there messages that when delivered by, in bilingual text rather than just English only are still moving them? I mean, that's an important, just preliminary matter. And we can't report back that we've had any success on this yet. We haven't. We're running the tests. We didn't want to just brush it under the rug and pretend like we're not trying to do this. We are trying, and we're going to continue trying. But I want to let you know, this is something that we're still struggling with. And we talk to a lot of other groups about it to figure out not just best messaging practices, but also just, are there more precise ways that we can identify likely Spanish speakers on voter files? Because it's far more difficult than you might imagine. So this is another thing that we're struggling with. Okay, a few more experiments, then I'll get to the midterms and then we can get to Q&A. When we were looking at our long-term cumulative results here, there were a few states where we didn't see growth. And we like to see growth, right? And so we thought, what's going on there? And the first one in that first column was Colorado and New Hampshire. That was kind of flat. It didn't drop off much, but there wasn't much growth. And we thought, uh-oh, what's going on there? Are we starting to screw something up? Thankfully, no. We looked deep into the voter files, and what we realized was, oh my gosh, were a lot of our voters, people who EVP had contacted, moving out of state. There were a lot of them were moving out of state. And that's not surprising, right? People who care deeply about climate and the environment are very young, and they are a more transient population. So we just realized, okay, this is something that we need to be more aware of, more mindful of, and then more transparent of when we talk about our long-term results. But then the other state where we didn't see a big jump was Georgia. And there, not only was it flatlined, we actually saw a drop. And so when we dug into the voter files there, we couldn't wholly attribute that to people moving out of state. Some of it was people moving out of state. But what we came to realize was this drop in turnout wasn't just happening among our targets. It was also happening among people who didn't care about the environment. It was happening among other progressives. And what we've come to realize in Georgia is The abnormally high turnout that we had been seeing since the dawn of the resistance, after Donald Trump was elected, not just in even years, but in odd years like 2017 and 2019, plummeted down to earth in 2021. Not in those US Senate runoffs, but in all the elections that followed. Now, a lot of that is just reverting to a mean, right? Like there was record high turnout for progressives in Georgia over the last few years. But whether it's reverting to the mean or not, like the cause, the reason isn't that important. We have come to rely on that level of turnout in Georgia, and we didn't get it last year. And when I say we, I don't mean the Environmental Voter Project. I mean we. the broader progressive movement isn't getting it. And I think that's something that really should start ringing some alarm bells. Really should start ringing some alarm bells. It should tell all of us that the upcoming primaries in Georgia are really important, not because of who wins or loses, but because it's a really important opportunity to start re-engaging with these voters. Finally, the last thing we learned is both in 2020 and in 2021, oh man, do environmentalists love to vote early. Again, not just the low propensity environmental voters we're targeting, but the high propensity environmental voters we're targeting, or that we're not targeting. They just love voting by mail. They love voting early in person. They love dropping it at drop boxes and mailing it in. That's really important to understand when you're figuring out when to message to voters over the next 7 months. It's also important when talking to voters about how the logistics of voting have changed. With all the voter suppression laws that have been passed, the ways in which environmentalists voted in 2020 and 2021, well, some of them might not exist anymore. Or if they do, there are fewer of those options. And so it's really important to communicate that. All right, looking ahead. Oh, sorry, if you want more on our results, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/results. All right, very, very quickly on the upcoming midterms, and we can go into more detail in the Q&A because we've still got about 16 minutes left. These are the 17 states that we are operating in. We now know all of the people we are targeting. I'm not going to start with all 17. First, I'm just going to start with 8 like sort of battlegroundy states because I know everybody has midterms on the mind. We have identified 249,841 super environmentalists who are registered to vote in the state of Arizona who have never voted in a midterm before. Actually, we've identified even more than that. These are just the ones in our treatment group. Remember, we pull aside a control group. And you can see 602,000 in Florida, 95,000, almost 96,000 in Nevada, 714,000 in Pennsylvania. And just so you have some context for these numbers, we also provided how many ballots were cast in these states last time there was a midterm. And what you can see is that 715,000 number in Pennsylvania, that's so big. These low propensity environmental voters who we have found and we know how to message to them from the hundreds of randomized control trials we've run. That's such a big number, it equals over 14% of all ballots that were cast in 2018. Now, some of you, if you've been to recent webinars, might notice these numbers are a little different than the last time we presented them. That's because we've updated them to reflect the voter file updates from last fall. There were some people who, when we looked at their voting history a few months ago, we thought, oh yeah, Josephine Smith on Main Street, she's not likely to vote in the midterm. But then voter files were updated and we say, oh, how about that? Josephine voted. Well, if she voted in the odd year election in New York State, well, she's probably likely to vote in the midterm now, so we're not going to target her. So these numbers are a little bit smaller, but they're still pretty enormous. And you'll see these are the 17 state numbers, and they're just huge opportunities. In Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania. I mean, Arizona has a gubernatorial, a US Senate, four tight congressionals. Colorado has 2 tight congressionals. New Mexico has 3. Pennsylvania has 5. New York has 6. These are enormous opportunities. We would love to have your continued support. Don't get me wrong, This is much more of a thank you and reporting back to you webinar than a please help us webinar. But I'm also not ashamed to ask for your support when I know we've got something that's working and I know how crucially important the next 7 months are. So very quickly, so we can get to the Q&A, go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. It's going to be in the chat there. Sign up to Phonebank, sign up to send postcards. Although our current campaign is capped, but we're going to be starting a new campaign in a few months. Sign up to go canvassing. Make monthly donations. 10, 15, 20, 50, $100 a month, whatever works right for you. Oh man, does that help us plan ahead. Not to mention, every single donation we receive in the month of April is being matched all the way up to a cumulative $100,000. And then finally, if you want to invite me to chat with your friends over Zoom so they can learn about the Environmental Voter Project, boy, would I like to do that. So please, please reach out to me at nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org. Finally, I just want to make you aware of this. Next week is Earth Week. As Shannon, our organizing director, always reminds me, it is also National Volunteer Week. So we've got these like stars aligning, Earth Week, Volunteer Week. How can you resist the siren call for you to sign up for a phone bank? And so we've got 3 Earth Week phone banks going on, the first of which is co-hosted by Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. And boy, would we love to have you join us and call voters in Tucson, Arizona. All right, we still have time for a Q&A, so we're going to get right to that. But thank you, thank you, thank you, and I can't wait to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel, and thank you to all of you who've already sent in your really good questions. You are welcome to keep sending them in, and we will do our best to answer all of them. But Nathaniel, one question off the top, and I'm not sure if you know the exact specifics here, but someone had a great question of the percentage of Americans of voting age who don't vote, and then how environmentalists stack up to that specifically.
Really, really great question. And obviously it is election dependent, right? There are non-voters for midterms and non-voters for presidentials and things like that. So what I'm going to do is try to sort of give you a waterfall of how things look. First, let's start with the voting age population. I believe, and forgive me if I get these round numbers wrong, I think my numbers might be a year or two off. I believe if we look at the voting age population in the United States, it's about 245, 250 million. But just because you are old enough to vote in the United States does not mean that you are allowed to vote in the United States. If you are not a citizen, you cannot vote. In many states, if you are a felon, you cannot vote, or if you have ever been convicted of a felony, you cannot vote. So below voting age population, you then get to voting eligible population. I believe that's closer to about 235, 240 million. But just because you're eligible to vote in the United States does not mean you are allowed to vote. We have this weird thing, which most of us just blindly accept, called registration. As far as I'm concerned, that's a form of voter suppression, but like it's become background noise to us, so we just accept it. How many registered voters do we have? It goes up and down because people fall off registration lists, but I believe for the 2020 general election, it was about 205 million registered voters, maybe a little bit closer to 210 million registered voters. All right, how many of those people voted in the presidential election in 2020? I believe it was north of 160 million, maybe even close to 170 million, 165 million, something like that. How many people vote in midterm elections? Well, the 2018 midterm election, we had 119 million people vote. In the 2014 election, we had only 83 million people vote. So you'll see as we go down this like waterfall here, we've got like over 200 million registered voters, over 235 million eligible voters, but only like 83 to 119 million voting in midterms. All right, where do environmentalists fit in that? Well, 12 million environmentalists who are already registered to vote skipped the last midterm election. They're registered, but they skipped. And when we look at voter files now, we believe that over 13 million who are registered to vote have never voted it in the midterm before. So that's a huge, huge opportunity there. Huge opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nathaniel. There have been a few questions about this, so that always means there's probably more people wondering. So I'd love if you could just briefly elaborate out loud on when you give some of these percentages from our randomized control trials, what does 0.9% mean in Georgia? Is that 0.9% of the total electorate? Could you just provide a little more background on that?
Really, really great question. So that means that turnout in our treatment group, so the low propensity environmental voters who we were communicating with, was 0.9 percentage points higher than turnout in our control group. So let's say in Georgia, we were communicating with 300,000, which I think is roughly right, 300,000 super environmentalists who were unlikely to vote in those US Senate runoff elections. What that means is we were solely responsible at the Environmental Voter Project for 0.9% of that 300,000 voting. So almost 3,000 voters. Another way of putting it is without the Environmental Voter Project spending our time and our volunteer resources, 2,900 super environmentalists would have stayed home in that election. Did that in and of itself turn the election? No, it didn't. It was decided by much more than that. But $1 billion were spent, and we were able to recognize that we were solely responsible for doing that, spending only 550,000. Moreover, before the election even started, you see what our cumulative impact was over the long term in Georgia. And that's not included in that randomized control trial. So it's important to remember all of that stuff. But yes, that's the important context for that stuff,
All right. So another question that we have is, we saw great results across many of our states in many elections. Could you talk at all about different methods of voter contact and how those stack up in terms of adding to these results?
Absolutely. So the two ways that we like to think about the different impacts that these behavioral interventions can have is by measuring their effectiveness and measuring their efficiency. So what do I mean by that? Effectiveness is what's the ceiling you can get? Like, how much can you increase turnout by knocking on someone's door as opposed to sending them a letter, as opposed to calling them on the phone? That's effectiveness. What efficiency is okay, once you measure that boost in turnout, whether it's big or small, how efficient was it? How much money did it take to get you that? Or how many volunteer hours did it take to get you that? So, talking about the ways that we communicate with voters, I'm going to mention both effectiveness and efficiency. By far and away, the most effective is still door-to-door canvassing. Now, it's not terribly efficient, even if it's completely volunteer, because it takes time and energy and even money to train volunteers and then send them literature and give them lists. And then it takes a lot of time to knock on doors. But holy moly, is it effective. I mean, depending on the election, sometimes you can boost turnout 5-6 percentage points with a good canvassing operation. The most efficient, so the highest ROI, whether you're measuring with volunteer time or measuring with the amount of money that you spend, is calling. And as we've mentioned in previous webinars, and I imagine has been mentioned in the Q&A, we're not doing texting at the moment. We're just waiting for some rules to be resolved in the mobile carrier world, but texting is also very efficient. So those are usually the most efficient, but they have a very low ceiling in the amount of turnout that you can get. The nice middle is direct mail and digital ads. They have this perfect blend of effectiveness and efficiency. But the important thing to realize here is that all of these methods of voter contact are almost always additive. And so the answer is not just, oh, okay, well then let's not do anything except for like send out direct mail. No, 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 no. We have a whole bunch of experiments that show if you layer door-to-door canvassing on top of phone calls, on top of direct mail, you do not end up losing any of that efficiency. And you do not end up losing cumulative effectiveness. It's actually additive. And so it's really important to do a lot of the stuff together.
Great. And I'll add a note to you, Nathaniel. I know you don't see the chat. Addison says your numbers were right on target with your memory around how many people voted in the presidential. So want to make sure you got that boost.
Thank you, Addison.
One question that's come in a few different ways is around voter suppression. Obviously, we can't ignore voter suppression laws that are happening all over the country. Could you speak a little about how you see EVP's role in this landscape and some things that we're doing as an organization to try to fight voter suppression for our voters?
Yeah, really, really good question. And because it's 58 minutes after the hour, folks, this is going to be the last question we answer because I want to respect your time, and then we'll just do a little close at the end. But you can always send us your questions over email as well. Yeah, voter suppression, I mean, aside from just being inherently evil and detrimental to the health of our democracy, is going to have a particularly bad impact on the environmental movement. And that is for a few reasons. One, at least with our very idiosyncratic definition of environmentalist, which is people who are likely to list climate or the environment as their top priority, that is a population that is disproportionately made of people of color, it is disproportionately young, and it is disproportionately people who make less than $50,000 a year. What do those three groups have in common? If anybody anywhere is trying to make it harder for someone to vote, chances are they are targeting people of color, young people, or lower middle class or poor people. And so the uncomfortable truth here is the object of voter suppression efforts is the environmental movement. That might not be what these government entities think they're doing, but it is what they are doing. And so this is going to be super, super important to us. What the Environmental Voter Project is doing? Well, we're not a litigation shop, and we are not a legislative advocacy shop. Other groups do that really well. We don't want to try to do it less well than they do. But what we can do really well is communicate with voters. And what we've realized is so important right now, because we just saw it happen in the Texas primaries, is that in previous elections, 0.8 to, I believe, 1.3% of mail ballots were rejected. But in the March 1st primary in Texas, I believe close to 20% of mail ballots, no, 12% of mail ballots were rejected. But that ended up being over 25,000 ballots, a huge, huge number. So what can we do at the Environmental Voter Project? We can reteach people how to vote. And that's something that we're going to have to do. Remember, I told you how important it was for environmentalists to vote early. We're seeing that in all of this voter file data. And so our people got used to 3 weeks of in-person early voting. Our people got used to no excuse absentee ballots and just signing up and say, yeah, send me a ballot. Well, they can't do that now, or if they can, maybe they need more ID than they're used to. And so this is something where we can't wait until October to let our people realize, holy moly, the way I thought I could vote doesn't exist anymore. And so what we're going to spend a lot of time doing over the next few months is using these upcoming spring and summer primaries as a way to kind of make an early intervention and reteach people how to vote before it's too late. Because honestly, like October is going to be too late. The good news is we can absolutely do this. We can absolutely do this. And I don't want people to be discouraged and feel like, oh my God, it has gotten so hard to vote that we're never going to be able to overcome this. No, no. There's going to be a lot of press about this. People are going to get really angry about it, and it's going to be really, really top of mind. So we're going to do it. We're going to be able to do it, but we also need your help. All right, it's 1 minute after the hour, so let's close by talking about how we also need your help. Please, please, please take a moment to donate to support our work. There is a link in the chat. When we close out of this Zoom, it's going to disappear. So click on the link now, just so it's open, just so it's available to you. Also, please, please sign up to volunteer for next week for Earth Week and National Volunteer Week. You're going to want to do something. Let it be talking to these low propensity environmental voters in Tucson, Arizona. And then the final thing I will just say is thank you. Thank you for being a part of this work. I hope it is valuable to you. And most importantly, I hope you feel real pride in these results, because we quite literally could not do them without you. We rely on volunteers, we rely on donations. And because of that, you're a part of this. And in some ways, it's almost like we're your campaign, just executing on your values. And so I hope that you really, really take a moment to pat yourselves on the back on all that we accomplished, not just in 2021, but in the years leading up to it. The fact that there are now 1,030,912 low propensity environmental voters who have been turned into super voters is really extraordinary. And I hope all of you recognize that and feel good about that. So thank you all. Thank you, Shannon and Ren, for answering all the questions. And please, if you have more questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@environmentalvoter.org. We will be happy to answer your questions. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful night.